Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors podcast. I'm Neil Thomas, and this is my co-host, Kevin James.
Great. Thank you, Neil. On the Improvisers podcast, we chat with performers about their histories, their practices, their conceptualizations around practice, their current interests, and their aspirations. Who have we got on today, Neil?
Today gives us an incredible pleasure to be in conversation with Antonia Pont.
Yeah.
She unravels for us the strange ways in which transformation and steadiness co-arise in life. She refers to her most recent publication, Plain Life, and offers her thoughts on thinking.
Antonia also muses on her early ontological questions as a child growing up in the countryside, considers an ethos of non-suspicion, and also talks about share houses and living without the need for approval.
I hope you enjoy this conversation with Antonia Pont as much as we did.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Let's go.
Welcome, Antonia Pont. Thank you so much for being in conversation with Kevin and I this morning. It's a thrill. We're so excited to be here. In fact, we feel privileged. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here.
Great. And congratulations on your recent publication, Plain Life on Thinking, Feeling and Deciding. I wonder if you could start with a brief history of your engagement with life through practices as a poet, essayist, theorist, yogi, and meditator.
Okay, that's a great question. A brief history. I think maybe I was always interested in words and movement, and I also had quite a I would say a spacious childhood, a little bit. There was space. We lived in more country areas for quite a while. So I kind of started experimenting, I think, with what later I realized were kind of ontological queries at quite a young age. Like, I think, asking myself over and over as a child, what is this? What is this? Like meaning life or substance or what was this moment I was in? And I mean, obviously this makes you have lots of friends in primary school or whatever, but no one really is very interested. But I think that opened up a curiosity very young, and oddly, or maybe not oddly, it opened up in parallel quite an ethical interest because those things seem to dovetail by necessity. But if you ask, what is this? Then you ask, what am I doing? If you ask, why isn't stealing good? Let's have a try. Whatever, trying to experiment, trying to think about things rather than from any dogmatic position, but from a sort of an interest in how the world is. And then I think I always wrote, because it was sort of, I grew up pre-internet days and books were a wonderful thing, and writing was a way to kind of, I think writing came in maybe when I less explicitly, thought of myself as praying to God or something. As a child, I was raised Catholic, so, you had a kind of, you had your invisible friend you talk to. But I think then writing becomes another kind of invisible friend that you talk to on the page. So that, that's all sort of swimming away in my earlier childhood, I think. And then adolescence is whatever it is. And I probably met a few figures who were helpful influences, maybe discerning influences when it came to spiritual inquiry, which I think can go off the rails very easily if one doesn't find solid circles in which to make those inquiries. So, meeting friends who had an interest in meditation. I have an essay on meditation called Private Practice. It's with Literary Hub, where I tell the anecdote of how I started doing Zen, and it's quite amusing, and it's just about my friend having a crush on a hot guy at the meditation group, and trying to support that crush. So also sometimes one finds oneself led into so-called spiritual activities, via the more is it the profane? Who knows? But it was very it's sort of a sweet anecdote that I love. So writing and then inquiring, I think, like being curious and I danced when I was a child. At sort of country dance schools that, weren't so fabulous and the training wasn't so fabulous. But, I'd dance on the front lawn and my mum would critique my form and tell me how to improve my crispness of movement. And I sort of, did gymnastics poorly because my body wasn't very, as in suitable for it. Um, and so movement was always part of things, I think, as a source of yeah, as a way of, we work through suffering in movement. You're not sort of, you don't get so cemented in it if you know how to move the body, whether that's walking or dancing, or I liked climbing trees and jumping on the trampoline, etc. So this is, I've taken us back quite far, but I'll try to briefly rush us forward. And then I think, as an adult, I think, hitting sort of the early 20s for many people, and we see this with anyone now who might be in their, late teens, early 20s. It's a stormy period of life often. And I think I was lucky because I wasn't in a moment that had a lot of ready-made labels there for me, delivered via the internet or the socials, trying to put myself in boxes. But I definitely was suffering in some kind of existential way. And so, writing and meditating and dancing and wondering if you're an artist and wondering if that's a good idea or whatever, all of that goes on. And if one sticks at these things, 25 years later, you wake up and you've published some poems and you're still meditating and you suffer a bit less or a bit differently, I think.
A number of years ago, you did a review of a Now Pieces event at Dance House, and it was around about COVID time. And I also had performed in that, and you did a review of the performance that I did. And I thought your writing at that time was so insightful regarding performance, regarding dance, and the whole nature of what might be called improvisation.
Mhm.
And I'm just thinking what you just said then. I also think of improvisation as something about being in the world. We have a repertoire of living, and in some ways we do become cemented. That's the word you used before. And this process of trying to keep our repertoire widening and
Yeah.
not cementing into sort of fixated patterns seems central to your most recent book and to your writing and to something about your approach to being in the world as an inquiry. Um, I'd love you to talk a little about improvisation, maybe within that context, in a way that might suit you as something about an inquiry into the lesser known or into the unknown, or that dance between our known and our availability to unknowing.
Thanks. Great question. And I'm glad the review was helpful. It was lovely to be involved in that. Um, yes, so becoming cemented is just an offshoot of how we are as organisms. In my book, A Philosophy of Practising, I spend a lot of time looking into theories of habit and how they operate. And so sedimentation of ways of being isn't really optional, and we're not doing anything wrong when that happens. But it can feel as if the world loses its sparkle in a particular way, and the world is sparkly. So there's something going on in the translation, there's something going on there. So, yeah, I think if I think about improvising as someone who isn't, let's say, explicitly identified with that term, but I think I have some hunch about it because of how I operate. Um, I think this idea that we don't suspect ourselves and our first response to what we offer the world isn't to shut ourselves down. So that there's something about, I think, improvisers know that we say yes. It's like, oh, I feel like placing my foot right there, like that, on an angle and feeling the ground. I think the improviser, of course, they're making discerning decisions and there's many other things they're not choosing. But maybe when a whim comes up, if it's not an egregious whim, if it's just a simple whim, then the improviser knows to say yes. And I think I try to go through that in the Plain Life book a lot. And I think it makes for some ornate sentences. As a friend said, she said, for a book that's called Plain Life, it's quite baroque. was like, yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it is. But it's trying to get a feeling of what it means to not have that initial thing, that one's initial response to oneself as a suspicion. So a kind of an ethos of non-suspicion, which doesn't mean then assessing, taking responsibility, being accountable, realizing that was an error. I don't want to repeat that. But I think the improviser risks making mistakes, but sees mistakes as part of something emergent. And if we were to try and avoid all mistakes, we couldn't live. We couldn't live at all. So improvising is as if a distilled version of what it is to live anyway, because we really can't foresee what anyone else's response will be. And when we do live like that, as in thinking we can predict it, I think that's when relationships get really messy and or unsatisfying or unworkable. But our relation to the world, if we leave the other to the other and let them have their response, whether that other is a tree or the ground or the air or a cake you're making or a friend or your parent, to sort of trust that the other will have their own response and that this isn't something we control. I think that really it makes everything so much easier, oddly, because the fantasy that we could control it is completely misplaced. So it's easier, and it's there are these beautiful little gracious moments that continue to sort of bubble up in a very ordinary life, I think, if one doesn't suspect oneself all the time and if one leaves the other to their response. And that's about allowing a proper separation. The other is the other, and they have their own internal world. They have their own wishes. They respond to you in a way you can't even perceive. We don't know how we perceive each other. But if that can be okay, then these bubbles of grace are actually they come reasonably frequently, I think. And the improviser, I'm imagining a dancer, is really just um, uh, yeah, distilling that general truth about the world into a kind of container where that becomes transparent to perhaps an audience or just to the person practicing alone.
Oh gosh, beautifully put. I'm curious about improvisation and your process of writing.
Hmm.
If you could talk about a lot of writers have like the writer's block syndrome, this that wanting to control what's going on, and
Hmm.
they often battle against that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process of writing, your varied processes of writing,
Yeah.
and cast it all
Yeah.
with the lens of improvisation, perhaps.
Thank you. That's a nice question. I think my writing practice began quite young in the form of a journal, and I always allowed the journal to be a bit shit. As in, someone like Anais Nin, they make it very clear. My journal is always imagining for publication. It's always really got a sort of a side eye on publication. So one curates oneself and one's anecdotes, etc. But I think I was always committed to the idea, and I was assisted by my own mum, who made it very clear she respected writing and that she would never read what I wrote. Now, I'm pretty sure that's true and that she honored that. And I've been astonished in meeting other friends and other writers that probably people who don't become writers, because often people's writing is betrayed. Parents think they can open the diary when the child's at school. The parent thinks they can ruffle through the drawers out of some gesture of safety. And there's other, obviously, digital forms of that now, but I think that gave me a very precious space of not being surveilled, and therefore I could write freely, also with all the mistakes and all the sentences that didn't end, that went nowhere. And when I teach students now at the university, we often do a lot of just stream of consciousness writing, or call it whatever you like, timed brackets of complete freedom. And it takes quite a lot of time for them to trust that. I always joke, I'm like, write it and then eat the paper. I don't care what you do with it, right? It's not even for reading back. It's something about doing the action of the writing as a physical fluency. So I think if that's a form of improvisation, I think I use it a lot. And when I write poetry, I have to handwrite it, and I have illegible handwriting, like worse than any doctor. Um, and so it's very odd. I have to write the poem out to catch the rhythm through the body, but then I really need to type it immediately, because if I wait 24 hours, it's just indecipherable. And I know that there's gorgeous words that simply I wrote so quickly that they don't even take the form of letters. So it's a very odd thing, but I've tried to type poems straight into a device, and they're much more dead. They just don't have the life in them. So so I think my writing process is yeah, quite improvised in a way, and quite freely associative, in that sort of Freudian psychoanalytic sense. Um, and but definitely, as I try and also tell students, it's informed by a sort of body of kind of latent material, of a writerly kind, that comes from reading widely. So what's so hard at the start, and that's why one doesn't read back, is that if one's only writing and then reading tweets or something, like there's no vocabulary available. There's no richness to draw on under pressure or at speed. So there is that, there is a diligence that accompanies the improvisation, and I'm sure dancers are similar. They often are trained, and sometimes quite strictly trained, as well as using an improvisational framework. But writing similar, I think one needs a big Lacan calls it the battery of signifiers, but you need a lot of stuff that just sits there unused but not asleep, so that when you are in that improvisational free associating mode, um, not only dross falls out. Sometimes some beauties fall out on the page, and they step just to the side of cliche, which of course, cliche is always waiting to kind of wrap us up again, but sometimes the sentence or the phrase falls just aside from that.
Antonio, I'm going to just read one paragraph out of your bio, and then ask you to comment a little on it. She, which is you, queries how our practices, whether artistic, contemplative, or ostensibly ordinary, protect the spacing that quietens reactivities to let the unknown arrive. I want to just follow that up with a passing comment that it seems that not only your recent book, but your approach to living has got a lot to do with experimental practices, experimenting with challenges and with ways of sort of broadening. Again, I'm going to call it our repertoire of living. But it seems to be beautifully sort of moderated by a type of generosity and forgiving for the sort of impossibilities in the world of often making change quickly, and we might fail equally as well as we might succeed in these experiments. So it seems to me that your suggestions are well tempered by a wonderful sort of generosity and humane caring. And I'd just like you to comment a little on that.
Hey, no, thanks. That's a lovely question. Um, yes, I think I'm, what's the word? I could call myself a kindness fundamentalist, but that probably is not quite right. Um, and there's a chapter in the Plain Life book, a long chapter called Rigorous Kindness, about this thing. But um, yeah, I wonder when I started to just realize that the meanness we have towards ourselves seems really illogical and out of proportion. And we have a super ego. Psychoanalysis is not too far off the money on that idea. We have a censor in us that can be actually very cruel. And various psychoanalysts write about the tonalities of the super ego, and how much we collude or don't collude with its take on us, or its take on other people, because what it does to us, it also encourages us to do on others. Um, so I do think, and I don't know when it historically in my chronology, when maybe that dawned, but I'm a yogi, and the first yama in the Eightfold Path, the Ashtanga, path that comes out of Patanjali. It is non-wounding, ahimsa, non-harming, non-wounding, or sometimes translated to non-violence. But it's a very strict lens, and I think I've had good teaching where it's been explained that it's a lens you place over what you're up to. Going to the shops, trying to do a handstand, doing 5 minutes of improvised movement to see what topples out. And it's very stern. There's a sternness to the importance of remaining close to ahimsa. So the a is the negative Sanskrit particle, and the himsa would mean wounding. So ahimsa is the non-wounding. To use that as a way to see how we are, to sort of see our impulse for a kind of casual, a casual stab, a casual scratch, a casual running ourselves or others down. And it's a source of, I think, dysfunctional human pleasure. Others would argue and say it's just in us and it's fine, just relax. But I've always been interested in seeing how much one can intervene on that impulse that's there. And it comes from us being an organism and being squishy and being vulnerable. It's a defensive response, but we are smart and we have quite developed intelligence, so maybe we can live with that vulnerability in another way. So yeah, I think the experiments, in a way, you used very wisely the binary success and failure, but I think, in that often there's wisdom stories where it's like you also don't know what a failure is and you also don't know what a success is. And we don't really know what the fallout of any of these moments will be. So we could be having a glowing moment of, basking in our success, and that very structure could next week turn into something less fun. And like that's what equanimity is rolling with the so-called pleasures and the so-called pitfalls, but also knowing that they're never absolute in that sense. I mean, at this point, I could say that my PhD was on Jacques Derrida, who is the master of helping his readers think away from that sort of extremity, that extreme sureness that we can have. It's like my success today might trail off into something a little bit awkward and not so fun next year. So if we can just experience those things, and it doesn't mean not having a nice moment in the moment, but to sort of assume that we've reached some kind of like, oh, now what are these things? Now I've nailed it. Now I've hacked life. It's like, it's not going to be how it is. It's not going to be how it is. So I tend to just abstaining from knowing too much, which then gets to your point about unknownness. I think my life started to tangibly get less difficult when I realized I just didn't know what anything would mean. And it's kind of a clumsy, but I do love it, title of my poetry book, which is "You Will Not Know in Advance What You'll Feel." I chose that. It's a line in one of the poems. I chose it for the title of the book because I think it's really true. And at any moment when we're feeling, let's say, some of the less clement feelings we might feel, or we are anticipating some terrible outcome or a terribly good outcome, we just simply we don't know what that future moment will feel like, because the future moment will sit in a matrix of that moment, and we don't have access to that matrix. So to project forward is simply, we do it, but it's simply a fun thing to do. It has nothing to do with what the experience when we reach that future time will be like. So speculate away, I say, if that amuses you, but the idea that it's coming, the fear we have is going to come and feel exactly the way we predict it will feel, is simply wrong in every case. So I take comfort from that I don't know how I will feel in a certain future moment. It's like someone would say, my partner's left me, I've lost my house, my job is on the brink, my future will feel like X, will feel harrowing and pointless and terrible. I'd be like, you just don't know. Like, it's still going to be every morning after every morning, and some mornings will have a certain feeling and something new will happen on those mornings. And you actually just don't know how this supposed, impending catastrophe will feel. And I think mostly people are worried about how it's going to feel. And I think that is a source of what gets called, not that I really understand the term, anxiety. Anxiety is very sure of itself. It's the part of our brain that says, I know what the future is and it's going to be rotten. But unfortunately, that part of our brain doesn't know the future and it can't determine that. Yeah.
How can you follow that up? Tricky. I a sideways question perhaps, but I often think about thinking, and I'd love to hear what you think about thinking. Uh, what is thinking? Is it useful? How does it relate to anxiety? Is it useful? Where does it come from?
You've asked me my dream question, Neil. It's I can't protect you from what's coming. Um, I really love thinking. I really love it. I'm really into it. I'm currently quite distressed that there's this popular term. It's very popular and it's very, very new, which is used by almost everyone I know, which disturbs me as well, which is this idea of overthinking. Because overthinking's never seen as a good thing. It's clearly a sort of insult to one's current mode of being. I'm overthinking it. I think it's often said to women, but I think it's expanded, it's expanded to include, unfortunately, everybody. Um, so before I go on a large rant about that, which will be tedious for all, um, it does sort of hint to me where I'm out of sync with the zeitgeist, because I just think, I say to young women or anyone of any gender in my classes, I'm just like, thinking's your power. Thinking is your power. Do you think someone who gets a pet dragon can ride it well the first day? No, it's a train wreck riding the dragon on the first day. I mean, we've got all these wonderful kind of fantasy movies about this, but thinking is a power, and it's something humans can do. And I'm fairly sure, is it Kant? I think it's Kant who says, reason has no kind of limit. Reason can go a bit wild. So like anything that is a sort of force in the world, it may go a bit wild. But I think thinking, when I realized how much I loved ideas when I used to read Derrida. At a cafe on Grattan Street near Uni Melb that's no longer open. It was called Animal Orchestra, such a beautiful little place, and we'd sit around and read Derrida in a group and try and understand what on earth it meant. And sometimes I'd get up to, go to the bathroom and I'd look at myself in the mirror and I was like, wow, you just look like you've climbed a mountain and you've just got alpine air. And, like I just never looked so healthy as when I was, at a reading group thrashing out the ideas of Derrida and trying to understand. It's like there's something exhilarating about good thinking. And I do think that many people don't access good thinking. And I sometimes use the term bad thinking, which is pretty judgy, but I do think there's a lot of bad thinking out there. And I unfortunately think the internet circulates it extremely effectively. And so, maybe there's some nuance we could use around thinking. Sometimes thinking kind of grabs us in an eddy, and that can be a little bit exhausting. Um, and as a meditator, if I find myself in an eddy of thought, first of all, I wouldn't blame myself. That would not be how I roll. It's something that flags either an energetic stuckness, could be in the body. I mean, it could be that the body's stuck and the body's throwing up a kind of loop almost from the physical, sending it the other way. So that's why movement or whatever can really help with those eddies if we're not enjoying them. Um, but sometimes I'm bothered by stuff, and I write this in the Plain Life book, because something's not right. Something's not right. And I do think it's either my behavior that's coming back to haunt me, or it's someone else has done something to me and I need to make an adjustment to how I relate to them or where I position them in my life if I can. So to be bothered by something, I think, is also a power rather than an inconvenience or annoying. And why can't I just be, I don't know, calm and peaceful? Like all these words I find really irritating because they're products now. they're products and accessories you can get and buy and whatever, and they're not really describing a state anymore. The state's very transactionalized, I think. But if I'm bothered by something for days and days, I need to sort it out, and I need to think about it more. Maybe with some good advice, maybe with a good interlocutor, maybe with a therapist, if something's actually coming back to haunt me from another time, or there's a way I've learned to be, or there's a way I've learned to process the world, which in all innocence is actually dysfunctional, and it's not good for me. And I think there are modalities of therapy that aren't trying to fix us. I don't like the fixing modes. I think they're disrespectful. They're not improvisational. They have already an outcome that they're aiming at to make everyone fit into some functional boxes for productivity. I'm not into those modes, and I do think they're pretty prevalent. And so that's hard. It's hard for anyone, but often it's young people who are trying to work out who they could go to, who would be trustworthy to have an honest conversation with. And I think they're right sometimes to be suspicious and a little bit cynical. So thinking, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing, and it's not opposed to feeling, I don't think at all. And it's not opposed to moving or, feeling kind of an immediacy of the world. None of that. So yeah, I'm a fan.
Antonio, I want to ask, I want to take it back a little bit to the concept of improvisation, especially those of us that have practices of improvisation, especially performative practices that often ask us to sort of relinquish ourselves to the process of moving, of speaking, of conceding to sort of emergence of material. And often it's sort of considered that thinking gets in the way of being available. And so sort of swimming in this sea of emergent material becomes a skill that improvisers develop, and there's a discernment to it, and there's a way of crafting performative pieces around it. So there is that sort of element of discerning and crafting and giving form to. But I guess after the event, there's often sort of a reflexive process of thinking about what happened and how it happened and what can be taken next time. So that sort of process is there. But Neil and I were chatting a little earlier about our practices and how we feel it impacts on our lives, our improvisational practice, and our availability to not knowing, our availability to emergent material, and our availability to sort of take risks around that and find out what happens. I sort of want to bring that to you as something that you might bounce off and respond to, as a process of sort of living in that place of being available to emergent material, to the lesser known, and yet being anchored enough in the sort of world of knowing to find the dance that works.
Mm, that's a great question. I could be underqualified to respond, but I'll try. I'll give it my best. I remember when I was trying to get into a share house. It was a very fancy share warehouse on, what was it? Little Burke Street. Fancy, sort of illegal, all of the things. And I remember in the interview, they sort of asked me something about an ethos. And I just had an experience which was quite challenging with another share house. That's the ways it was. And I remember I found myself saying, "Oh, I've just learned you've got to live without approval." And I think it nailed me, the share house, which was, a glamorous couple of years living in a strange way. But I do think, well, I'm imagining here as someone who doesn't regularly do explicit improvised performance, that the performer might need to simply put aside the seeking of approval from their audience. I imagine that's important. Not bucking approval, or not trying to generate an abject response or disgust or something. That's a similarly reactive thing, but somehow just a quiet setting aside of approval in a way that's it's not their business for a while, because the emergent material probably is unclassifiable as well. The audience themselves may not know whether they approve or disapprove of it at all, because it might be new for them and sort of still be outside of category. So I imagine that that's really important, and that wanting approval is a kind of demand that's placed on another or on the audience. It asks them to do something for you. It's like, please approve of me. That would make me enjoy this more, or that's really what I'm after, as we all might be. But there's something generous if the performer both respects the audience but doesn't demand something from them. So it's not irrelevant the audience is there. The audience is a crucial participant in the live experience that's happening. They provide a certain framing that wouldn't be there if you were alone. But at the same time, it's not transactional. The performer's not saying, I'll do this thing if you give me some approval, please, or to sort of, sit on a knife's edge of hoping to get something from. And there's a generosity to that. I think when the improviser puts that aside, we all get to see something new. They get to be something new, and we get to see something new. I remember being at Cecil Street a long time ago, and it was an improvisation night, and there were trained dancers there, and then there were people who did the improvisation workshops, but obviously without a dance background. And there was a real pleasure and generosity and generativity to watching both the trained and the non-trained bodies sort of navigate each moment, and navigated with a kind of dignity and respect. And because the audience were well educated in improvisation, there was no sense that the untrained bodies needed to be ashamed of themselves or needed to kind of mince around and apologetically, whatever. They just moved from their own patterns, but we got to see something, different from watching a chorus line or something. And I found my aesthetic found that much more interesting than to see this kind of polished, perfect delivery of a product. One saw something being formed in front of, in front of the audience and the performer as well. Does that answer, Kevin, at all?
Um, yes, it does. It does, and we could go back and forth and actually keep unfolding this. But I'm very very happy to acknowledge that relational situation with the audience and the not appeasing, if that's the word, or yes, not bending to that sort of requirement. That's a part of being liberated enough, I think, to the material that's emerging without being bound to entertain or satisfy. But I want to hand it over to Neil now for the next question.
I've got an easier question. You write in the bio, you're interested in time, silence, weather, and the strange ways in which transformation and steadiness co-arise. I'm interested in hearing you talk about the weather.
Hmm. Hey. Well, I mean, I wonder whether the weather might become something we are more and more scared of. I think that's possible. So I preface what I'm about to say with that. Um, but there's also just something, the fact that people phatically exchange with each other about the weather, that's just what we do linguistically. We have these kind of gestural conversations about, the weather, da, da, da. I think it's because it's such a collective thing that we all experience together. Like even someone from, let's say, the vastly opposite side of politics to anyone, you can have a conversation about, the rain or the storm or the bruisey sky or, the wind that's making everyone grumpy. Or so I think I'm interested in weather. I also grew up for a few years under a really extreme drought in the country. So I developed my own aversions to certain modes of weather. I'm afraid of the blistering blue sky. Too much sun doesn't signal cheerfulness in my sort of historical brain. It signals like the ongoing danger of no water. But I'm sure people who've experienced extreme flooding recently will have similar kind of associations that form, and it's very hard to unhook those associations once they form. Um, but I think, I sort of there's just something so amazing about the weather, and I'm interested in. I'm probably as a writer, at least, I think I have a good sense of plot in a way, but I would claim more to be more interested in atmospheres. So I'm just really interested in the atmospheres of artworks. Deleuze might call that their affect or something like that, the way that they give you a feeling that you can't name and you've never had before. And weather is actually, even though there's a few big categories of weather, there's a few pictures on our apps, that it's also something unique every time if you meet it with a sort of openness. The day is its own person. The mood of the night is its own person. So it's not very deep, but weather, it's super interesting, and it also reminds us that we're connected to bigger patterns that completely transcend our nitpicking, smaller, preoccupations, that we are on a planet and something bigger goes on around us. So
That the quote that from your bio that Neil just read, I'm going to pick up on the last few words. And the strange ways that transformation and steadiness co-arise. And I love that sort of sense of transformation and steadiness being both integral to being in the world. That we can so easily become a sort of addicted to change or wanting to continue to change, overlooking the place that steadiness has. But the strange ways that they sort of coexist and co-arise, I love that sense of we can't know it so well, we can't know it so clearly. It is strange, and yet both are sort of somehow necessities of living. But too much of one or too much of the other creates either instability or too much stability. It's a lovely phrase that you mentioned there. I'd love you to say a little bit more about that if you would.
thank you. That's yeah. It's that was the crux of my query that generated the book called A Philosophy of Practising. I really, after doing yoga and meditation for a very long time, I I had just factually encountered over and over again that practicing brings on a stability for the person, for want of a better word, or the context. And oddly, that stability was the requirement for transformation. So I repeat Surya Namaskar goodness knows how many times every year, the same thing, a stable structure, no changes, not even trying to, not definitely not trying to modify or, make it more ornate, just the same thing over and over again. But that I saw that if I engaged in such a stable, repetitive practice that was benign, that didn't injure me, that was, intelligent enough, then I could transform. I could let my old version go and become a new version. And I just found that fascinating, this idea of not needing to stay the same, but oddly accessing that through a commitment to apparently trying to repeat the same. And of course, Deleuze is the philosopher to help a person think through that, because he's so close and precise about those things. So that's, I mean, I think somewhere, um, I think maybe it's in the Plain Life book, like that newness lurks among the tissue of regularity, you know? And this is just true. So we don't need to chase after kind of really rash change. I mean, rash change comes for us. We don't need to chase it. It'll come. It's actually in the sort of stabilizing ourselves enough that that self can drop, and we can just find ourselves appearing in a new future that we hadn't foreseen. I think and I find it an ontological kind of paradoxical sort of wonder that if you want change, you've got to go via stability. And it is a philosophical position of mine, because I think the late 20th century, some would argue with me on this, and there was a sort of fetishizing of destruction as creative. And I call it a little bit adolescent. The adolescent thinks that if they fuck shit up, something good will come. And mostly you just get a pile of broken things. And it takes a very long time to realize that I don't think destruction leads to creativity. There's a forgetting or a letting fall, which I wouldn't call destruction. I would call it just something, it's subtractive. Something subtracts itself from the context. But yeah, but I think weirdly the most transformative thing can be a kind of stability that isn't sedimented. And in the practicing book, I make it very clear that the hinge point is a practice of relaxation. And I'm quite precise about what the relaxation means. It's relaxing one's attachment to the activity. It's relaxing one's constant reference to self. Something relaxes and the stability holds the process, and then the transformation can happen.
I think it was maybe Archimedes. I think it was Archimedes. He said, give me a fixed point and I'll move the world.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I was thinking I've had experience of that too. So your words are really resonant. Such a lovely gift this morning that you've given us and the listeners. We're going to have to bring it to a close now, though, Antonia. Before we do, is there one last thing that you would like to say? Doesn't matter if there's not. It's something that you've wanted to say, but it hasn't arisen.
No, thank you for asking. I'm really just grateful for the wonderful questions. They're questions I would want, and it's been really fun to speak to them. Like very, very insightful, very intelligent ways to open conversation, which is what improvisers are good at, I think. Conversation is one of our most widespread improvisational modes. Conversations that can be an improvised conversation, I think that nourishes everybody.
I'd like to round it off. I want to pick up on one of the last words you used, which was relaxing into. And I think it's probably something we haven't spoken much about today, about the process of improvising, because I think those that improvise well have usually found a way of relaxing into the unpredictable, relaxing into the uncontrollable, relaxing into the place where things will emerge and we're available to them. So thanks for bringing that word in just before. It's something I think is quite profound in a way. Relaxing, not becoming too at ease, but relaxing meaning being sort of a more open availability, where we can trust and risk and not be too fearful. So thank you for that, and thank you for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you. Really, it's been a lovely way to spend a morning. Thank you.